You can pray for me. I'm headed into the wilderness today to hang out with our kids. And by wilderness, I mean Irvine Park over here in Orange. So but I get to hang out with our kids today and see what God is doing. Excited for that. We want to think about surviving the wilderness a little bit today. And surviving the wilderness is tough. I don't know if you've ever, like some of you might probably like watching Bear Grylls or some of the different shows, all the different things about how to think about how to do it. I mean, our family, we got into Survivor when it first started, and it was really interesting. All our friends would come over, and it was kind of humorous, at least to me, to listen to all these suburban people talk about how they would survive these conditions and things like that. And I was really convinced if I ever got on the show, I would be eliminated early or I would die. One of the two, because I have no survival skills whatsoever. But my first year as a youth pastor, we did a trip up to the American River. We did a river rafting and rock climbing trip, and it was a really fun trip, but I realized I was a little out of my element. I had to be really dependent on the team we were with, but I had one guy with me on our team that was like, I could tell this was his element. You could tell when we got up there, we got set up and kind of our campsite set up. There's a little brook going by, a stream going by, and he's just deep breath taking it all in. And he showed me, he kept in his pocket this, I guess it was a keychain, but he had this like keychain, and on it were all these gadgets and gizmos, and he said, Bill, I could survive anywhere for as long as I needed. And he started to show me all these different things of what he could do. And so I said to him, hey, I will bet you $1 that you cannot catch a fish using just your keychain by the end of this week. And he looked at me, his eyes got so big, and he's like, you are on. And he went out, he started just like foraging through. He found a tree limb, he whittled it down with a knife and turned it into a fishing pole. He had a piece of parachute cord he started to take apart and weave it all together to make fishing line. He's scanning the sides of the little stream that's going by, and he's trying to figure out all the different bugs that were living in the ecosystem so he knew the right bait to do. And I'm just watching him just like, I have no idea what you're doing. But every day he would get up and he would work on it, and he was just so intent. We get to the last day, and I'm asleep. The sun is just coming up. And as I wake up, he's kind of just kneeling there holding his fish. Just so proud that he has got this fish. I'm like, hold on, I'll get you your dollar. He's like, no need. I just wanted the satisfaction of it. And he went then and basically built his own fire from scratch and cooked it over a stick over the fire and the whole thing. And it was so impressive to watch him. I just walked over to the mess hall and had to make me bacon and eggs or cereal. I don't know what it was, but that was how I could do this. But we're going to think about what it looks like to spiritually survive in the wilderness times of our faith. This morning, this is part of King David's story. So as we think about the life of David, we're thinking about how to trust God in uncertain times. So in week one, we thought about this idea of calling. How do you trust God when God interrupts your life and there's a calling on you? How do you walk in this? What does it look like to have a heart that God can look at and see? And we've been doing these heart checks. Last week, we thought about facing our giants. What is the giant in your life, and how do you, who's your champion? That Jesus is our champion. This is a story that points to Jesus, and Jesus, the one who enters into the valley, who takes on sin and death for us. But today we're going to think about what it looks like to trust God when we are in the wilderness. And this is a part of David's epic story. And it's kind of fascinating because you think about everything that's kind of led up to this moment. It just seems like everything is moving up to the right? He's a forgotten kid out in the fields raising and tending the sheep. He's anointed as the next king. We see there is something special in him in that he is the only one who's willing to take on a giant, and he defeats him. Everything seems to go this way. In fact, David was recruited by Saul to be part of his team and his group, his army. But things quickly change because the people see God's anointing on him. And they begin to call out, Saul's killed his thousands, but David has tens of thousands. And Saul becomes incredibly jealous, vindictive. And so David finds himself going from being a trusted person in Saul's life to being someone that Saul is hunting. And David, we see, is someone who is in despair and exhausted, and there's pain. And he's calling out to God as like, hey, I didn't sign up for this. Like, why am I in this situation? And we're going to see that there's a moment in David's life where he knows the promises of God, he knows the power of God, but somehow his circumstances and those truths are not lining up together. And so we want to think about what do you do in those times? So how do you trust God in those times when we are in the wilderness? And so let me invite you to think, and Dave did a great job. Let me just invite you to bring this back to the surface. What is that thing right now? How would you describe the wilderness of your life right now? What is making you anxious? What is making you concerned? What does your wilderness look like? Maybe more importantly, can you be honest? What does your wilderness feel like? Where's there disconnect between your knowledge of God's goodness and the circumstances you are experiencing? And we have to ask ourselves, where do we turn when we feel like we are facing these things alone, where it feels like somehow, some way God should be delivering us, but he's not? And so the big idea I want us to see today as those thoughts come to mind is know this, that the Lord is with us in the wilderness. That the Lord is with us in the wilderness. What we want to see from David today is that despite what we are experiencing, that in some ways we want to see how do we put our hope in the Lord? How do we, in those moments, find that the Lord can be our refuge? And so I want you to look at the things that David reveals, but it's so important that you listen to his words, that you feel the things that he is feeling. I want you to watch and tune into it because he reveals important things about who God is, but also important ways in which we live our lives with God, especially in the inevitable seasons of wilderness. You either can look back and remember a time of wilderness and say, whew, that was rough. I mean, I'm thankful for God getting me through it. But some of you can point back and you can point to it. Some of you are in it right now. Some of you are like, this is like, I can't figure out which way is up. But all of us know that seasons of wilderness are inevitable. They're in our path, they're in our future. And so I want us to, we're going to read Psalm 142 together. So would you turn to Psalm 142? It's page 507 in the Bibles. And this is a parallel passage to the story we've been reading. So this psalm is a moment, think of it this way, if you're watching the Olympics and you're listening to, on the one hand you have the broadcaster who's telling you about the action. And on the other hand, you have the commentator who's telling you why the person is doing what they're doing. And this is a chance where 1 Samuel tells us what is happening, and Psalm 142 says, well, let me tell you the deeper part of what is really happening in the midst of this. And so to do this, we need to see what this is all about. Let me set up this a little bit just so you understand, because we have to figure out how does David go from giant killer, right, to, in chapter 22, what we're going to see as cave dweller. His story is a story of great success to great jealousy. The people calling out, turning their allegiance to David. And because of that, Saul becomes incredibly jealous. In fact, many times he will attempt to kill David. In fact, there's one moment where he kind of manipulates David. He wants to give his daughter to him in marriage, but he says, look, go take out 100 Philistines and you can have my daughter. And he thinks if David's going to say yes to this because of who he thinks David is, but David will die in battle. There's no way he can handle this. David instead takes out 200. And so it just kind of creates this more difficult sense in his life. Multiple times he tries to throw a spear right through him as David's playing a harp, trying to soothe Saul. Saul's son has to protect David. Saul's daughter has to protect David. He's chased all over the countryside. And so in this, we see David has gone from the most successful warrior to the most wanted. And you have to think the whole time is like, wait, I thought he was supposed to be king. This does not seem like a trajectory to becoming king. But if you've been anointed king and there's still a king in play, this is going to create some of the tension. So here is What we want to read about is David finds the only safe place for him, the place that will save his life, the safe spot. It's called the Cave of Adullam. I'll put it here on the screen, 1 Samuel 22. I want you to lean into verse 1. This helps us understand the context. But we're going to come back to verse 2. If you can just kind of remember verse 2, it's a little interesting. Just try to remember it enough, and I'll bring it back to our attention. But verse 1 says this, that David left Gath, he escaped the cave and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and father's household heard about it, they went to him there. So he's running, he finds escape. His escape and his safety is this cave. Verse 2 says, all those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. Now, it'd be very easy just to rush through verse 1 and just say, okay, next in his life is he hung out in a cave, then all these people came, and we just keep moving. But Psalm 142 tells us that moment of finding this cave, of his life in the cave, was a significant moment, so much so that he wrote a whole song about it. And so Psalm 142 is a psalm, and you might even see this as a title, a maskil of David. It's the idea of how it might be used in a literary or musical term. But it's the idea of, that this is something that has instruction and guidance and wisdom. But notice it says, of David when he was in the cave, right? This is what it felt like to find refuge in the wilderness in a cave. Here's what David felt. He says, I cry aloud to the Lord. I lift up my voice to the Lord for mercy. I pour out before him my complaint. Before him I tell my trouble. When my spirit grows faint within me, it is you who watch over my way. In the path where I walk, people have hidden a snare for me. Look and see, there's no one at my right hand. No one is concerned for me. I have no refuge. No one cares for my life. I cry to you, Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Listen to my cry, for I'm in desperate need. Rescue me from those who pursue me, for they are too strong for me. Set me free from my prison, that I may praise your name. Then the righteous will gather about me because of your goodness to me. Psalm 142 reminds us that even when God calls you to be king, there can be seasons of wilderness. There can be seasons of spiritual uncertainty. That all of us will experience these times of disappointment, these times of suffering. And these times can come for a variety of reasons, right? Sometimes they come because of the evil someone else commits in our life. This is part of David's story, right? David didn't ask for this, but he's being hunted by a madman. And so David has this chaos in his life, this disappointment in his life because of the choices someone else is making. Sometimes we experience this disappointment or this suffering or this pain because even though we want to make things right, there are factors outside of our control. So sometimes you don't have control over what your company is going to do. Sometimes you want to reconcile with someone, but they are not willing to reconcile with you. There are times where the disappointment and the pain and the struggle that we experience is not because we don't have a desire to make it right, but we don't have control over the situation. But we also know this, sometimes the reason why we are suffering, sometimes the reason why there is disappointment in our life is because we have made poor choices. We have sinned, we have been thoughtless, we are reaping what we have sowed. We can say honestly, yeah, I'm in trouble and it's because I have made some really poor choices and I'm experiencing the consequences of this. We will see this later in David's life, that David, even though he's a man after God's own heart, a man of God's own choosing, will make choices that he will soon regret. But sometimes the disappointment, the suffering, is the result of actually living for God. It's the idea that we are trying to do the right thing. We know this all throughout the world, even today. There are those who are living passionately for God. They're trying to spread his word. but they are oppressed and they are persecuted for the very fact that they are doing this. And this is what we want to see. The idea of disappointment is that our expectations and our reality, there is a gap. That what we hope would happen, what we think would happen, and what is really happening, there is a huge gap there. And we have to think about, how do we handle those moments? How do you handle those moments when you are confident that God is with you? When a significant relationship is now over, when a plan that you had for your future is not going to happen, when the college you applied for says no, what do you do when you're confident that God is with you in those difficult times? I thought it was going this way, but here's where we are. Now, what do you do when you have that disappointment gap and you also have that lack of confidence that God is with you? You're in this disappointment gap, but you cannot feel the overwhelming sense of God's power and his presence, his comfort. How do you handle those things when you can't feel God? How do you handle those things when you feel like you're sinking down and God is not reaching out to pull you out? There are incredible stories, right, of God rescuing people and miracles in the Bible. And we feel like, why is that not happening? And in reality, we can say there's also stories of suffering and people going through difficult things. One of the great gifts that God has given us is the book of Psalms, a book of prayers, of songs. It's wisdom literature. It is meant, there's a sense of you should, there's wisdom we get about how to live our life with God, but there's a way in which, especially the Psalms, where we feel deeply with this. And in the Psalms, over 70 Psalms, you see a ruthless honesty of pain, of lament, of confusion. And what we come to understand is God has given us this beautiful book in the Bible, this prayer book. And it's as if God has said to you, there will be times in your life where you don't know how to pray to me because you're mad at me, or you're going through crisis, or you're confused. And you don't know what to say to me because it feels like what you want to say, you're not allowed to say. And so I'm going to give you words to pray to me when you don't know what to say. And these Psalms are powerful. They are authentic, and they boldly express for us the sorrow we feel. See, we think in reverence from God, we need to hold back from what we're really feeling. Friends, he already knows what you're feeling. And so the gift of these Psalms is that in some ways you can say, this is how I feel. I feel all alone. I feel like no one's there for me. No one's going to rescue me. I can't find you in this. And so here's the first thing I want you to see from David's prayer here, is that we need to be honest with our pain. You can be honest with your pain with God. 1 Samuel tells us all we need to know about how far David has sunk. He's gone from minding his own business to great heights to now hiding for his life. I mean, that's a disappointment gap. You're going to be king. You need to hide in a cave. Like that's what it's going to take to get from here to there. And if you notice in the language, notice in verses 3 and 4, and we'll see this, you'll notice this in Psalm 23, a psalm that David writes, that often when the Psalms get to their darkest place, David shifts the kind of perspective. Instead of saying things about God, he shifts the attention right to God. It's as if he locks eyes on him and says it right to his face. And you feel in David all these things. I'm faint, I'm desperate, I'm disoriented, I feel abandoned and lonely. No one cares for my soul. I'm rejected. I'm isolated. I'm brought low. Right? There's a sense of despair and depression and frustration and anxiousness. and he doesn't know what to do about it, and he doesn't know where to find the resources. He is completely desperate. And I just want you to take for a second, I think, you at Beachpoint, we take the Bible very seriously. This is in the Bible, and do you see God react with lightning bolt to David's face? Like, how dare you say this to me? Right? There's a permission. This is the goodness of God to say, no, be honest about what you're feeling in this moment. I'm in it with you. And David is honest. There's no sugarcoating in this. Now, this is the problem for us in our faith. We mean well. We mean well in our faith. And sometimes in these places, we say things we shouldn't say, right? The couple that is dealing with infertility, we say, you just got to relax, right? Jason, who was one of our pastors here, he lost his infant daughter after 30 days. And a woman, she meant well, but she said, it's for the best. Right? No one's trying to be harsh in this, but we don't know how to live in those places. They're uncomfortable for us as people of faith. But sometimes it's okay to mourn with those who mourn. And sometimes it's okay to sit with someone in your life group or sit with your friend and just to sit there and say, this sucks. I'm so sorry you're going through this. And sometimes we just sit in that pain for a while in it. And David is able to say these things in a very tenacious way, not looking away from God, but being honest about what it feels like to be in the wilderness, to be in the cave. He's losing hope, and he's stuck. What do? Well, the other part of this is you have to see is that in these places, David calls out to the Lord. In the wilderness, we're not just honest with our pain, we call out to the Lord. So David's heart and prayers are honest. He's not hiding his pain. But notice that this is not just him in a place, a pity party with outside of his faith, that he's brought this to God. In fact, verse 2 is super interesting in the way that it's structured. It's called a chiastic structure. There's a repetition to it. It has a form to it that if you look at verse 2, you see the way that he's repetitive about pouring out, right? I pour out before him. I tell my trouble to him. He's able to see this idea that the central idea is that he has a complaint. And when we see this idea of repetition happen, when we see him say, I pour out before him my complaint, before him I tell him my trouble, that he's giving a poetic structure to this. He's helping you see in some way this idea that he's turned his face to God. He's saying, to you I'm turning this. And there's a beauty to what he's writing there as he makes his petition. This is a direct lament to God. Now, watch what David does in verses 5 and 7, because in all of these psalms, where they dip, all of them but one of them just stays down and bottoms out and just like crush their heads on a rock like it's dark. Like you got to be careful when you read that one. But all of them, they go down, and then they bounce at the bottom. And they bounce with this idea that, but my hope is in you. And there's somehow in this, even in the darkness of what he feels, he knows that there is some sense of hope. You will be my hope. You will be my refuge. You will be the one who gets me through this. And in verses 5 to 7, we see that he's reminding himself of God's character. That you are a refuge, that you are my portion. You're the one who I find strength from. You are a rescuer. And he reminds himself of what the Lord is capable of. And he's reminding us of something that the Bible does a lot, and we'll do this a lot in the fall as well, that the Bible is trying to help you see something sometimes, that what you are experiencing is not all there is. There's more than you can see. There's more at work than you can see, and David knows this. The Apostle Paul writes it this way. He says to the Corinthian church, he writes, we do not lose heart. Outwardly, we're wasting away, yet inwardly, there's a faith that's growing. Inwardly, we're being renewed day by day. Our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes, not what is seen, but what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. David has a bigger perspective, the same perspective that Paul can then give to the Corinthians, that there's something more going on. I'm in this situation, but somehow, some way, I know, are in it. There's more going on. There's more power available to me. And so he pours his heart out, and he's, in essence, waiting on the Lord. Which brings us to verse 2. Because verse 2 is God's answer to his prayer, but it's not the answer I don't think he was looking for. Do you remember what? So here's the thing with verse 2. Look at verse 2. 1 Samuel 22, verse 2 says this. All those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. David is feeling all this pain, all this struggle, and what does God send him? 400 people who feel worse, right? It's the island of misfit toys. It's just, I'm looking for help. I'm looking for some way out, and God says, I've got the perfect thing for you. Here are 400 people who feel exactly like you. So here's the thing I want to encourage you today as we think about a response in this. I want to encourage you to be honest with God. I want to encourage you to turn your eyes and turn your heart and turn your hope to God. But you need to be ready to pivot. Be ready to pivot. His hope is in the Lord, and this is how the Lord shows up. That the Lord shows up in a different way. He is a refugee, and now he is asked to be a refuge. And what's fascinating about this story is these people eventually become, some of you know the name of his mighty men. They become his army. Some of them will be part of his cabinet. What it looks like in this moment is not, God is taking this in a whole new trajectory, in a whole new area. You have to be ready to pivot in your disappointment. This is the story of Moses, right? That he's told he's going to lead the people out. And what happens? He has this great vision. He tells everyone. He goes to Pharaoh. Pharaoh says no. He makes it worse. Moses shaking his fist. God, you said you were going to do this. You didn't do what you said you were going to do. And God says, I got him right where I want him. And there's a whole thing where he takes him next. This is Nehemiah. Nehemiah's content being the cupbearer to the king. And then he gets word, how's everyone doing? The wall is down. And he has this pain point. And then what comes out of the pain point is pivot. He's going to take a risk. He's going to go before the king. He's going to ask for help, and he's going to try to rebuild the wall. This is a story of Jonah, right? God says to go to Nineveh, and he says no. And sometimes, I hope it doesn't take a fish swallowing you to pivot, but sometimes maybe that's what it takes. But if you go through this, if you begin to see this, we see that all through church history and all through our stories, we know that to be the same. Could it be that this disappointing moment right now that you are experiencing is preparing you to pivot? My dad went from being laid off from a successful business job to becoming a missionary. And he's been a missionary the last 20 years with the Jesus Film. If you look at the stories of those of church history we call the saints, St. Olga, St. Ignatius, St. Teresa of Avila, St. Francis, St. Augustine, all of them have backstories and somewhere along the line pivot to something totally different, a direction they did not see themselves in. This is a story of Peter, right? He's just mulling over a bad night of fishing. He just wants to mend his nets, fold them up, and go home. And Jesus calls him to pivot. Matthew and Zacchaeus are making good money, throwing great parties. And Jesus asks them to pivot. Mary only sees her life as one of brokenness and darkness. And Jesus calls her to pivot. And at the cross, Mary Magdalene is there. And at the resurrection, she's the one who announces he is alive. Pivot. Are you ready to pivot? This church has a fascinating history. In the fall, we'll celebrate that 120 years ago, there was basically a life group of people that felt a call to start a church in Huntington Beach, before Huntington Beach was even a city. In 1904, they began dreaming and praying and thinking of what it would be like to start a church in this new area. In 1906, you can go down, you can see the chapel that they built, and this whole thing is taken off, the First Baptist Church of Huntington Beach. About 60 years later, they are doing so well, they've outgrown the facility. They need to find a bigger place because God is doing things. And so they secure the land over by Bellatero, where the bus depot is over there. That was going to be the new home of First Baptist Huntington Beach. It was all set up. We literally have in the attic, we have drawings of it. They had everything set up. This is where it was going to be. And they had the funding pulled from them. Talking about disappointment, your church is growing, everything's working, and now you don't know what to do. They've got to go back. There's a little church plant happening in Westminster, and a meeting at the mortuary there, the cemetery in the little chapel there. If we ever plant a church, we're not starting in a cemetery, but that little group merges together with the Huntington Beach group. All the while here in Fountain Valley, there's a bunch of neighbors meeting in a bonus room off of Bouchard and Heil. They purchase this land. They start First Baptist Church of Fountain Valley. And God has a pivot in store. First Baptist Church of Huntington Beach and First Baptist Church of Fountain Valley decide they're going to merge together. That is not easy to do. But I was down there this morning, down at Orange and 6, praying and just thinking, I wonder if those people who started this whole vision, if they could see what all has happened now, like what they would think of the thousands and thousands of people who have come to Christ through everything that is happening. Are you ready to pivot? I can't think of a better image of pivoting than baptism. Next week we will be doing baptisms. We have a number of people being baptized, and if you're not signed up yet and it's time for you to be baptized, I want to encourage you, find me afterwards or sign up, do something, but we want to include you next week. But think about this. Baptism is this moment, and think about your baptism vows. What I want to encourage you is, if you think about this, there was a moment where you were doing just fine with your life, and then you decided that you were going to pivot. You heard the gospel. You heard about what God did for you in Jesus. You wanted to share about your faith in Jesus. You wanted to say, this is what I believe. And you wanted to say, my old life has been buried, and I am being raised to live a new life following Jesus. And if that's where you are and you haven't been baptized, I want to encourage you, take that step. Follow Jesus. Pivot. He's calling you into a life with him. And those of us who have done this know simply this, that the life of pivoting with Jesus is a day-by-day, moment-by-moment thing. We constantly just listen to his Spirit, all the unique ways in which he's calling us to follow him. And so as we sing this last song, would you stand together with me? And would you take a moment, think back to what Dave brought to the surface earlier in the service. And if you could almost hold it open before him to say, Lord, here is what I am struggling with. Here's my pain point. Here's my disappointment. You know it. And I'm asking you to meet me in that. And where you want me to pivot, I want to be ready. I want to be open. I want to take the next step. Show me the next step of faith. Lord, we thank you for the ways that you meet us in the cave. And honestly, there are times where on the surface, we don't want to see 400 other struggling people be the answer. But what we want to say this morning in the clarity of a time of worship is we trust you. Our hope is in you. That you are our portion. You are where we find our strength. You are our refuge. And so we can't always see what it is you're leading us into, but we're thankful that you're leading us. And so we pray that you lead us well into this next thing. And so we give it to you in the name of Jesus. Amen.